How you guys doing? This is Captain Spencer here, and we're just going to kind of go over a couple different tips that I noticed, from getting to fish with a lot of different people, being a professional fishing guide down here at Table Rock Lake. Just some things that I think that are going to help you catch a lot more fish in your future trips. So one of the most common mistakes you see a lot of anglers make when it comes to fishing is they might have their drag set incorrectly. So what I've kind of figured out over time is that what you really need to do is make sure your drag is really tight. You don't want a whole lot of slippage when it comes to setting the hook. Even if you're throwing like a small bait, like say a Ned rig or something like that, you're fishing, a really deep lake like the one I fish. Whenever you get a bite, most of the time you've got plenty of line out there to really absorb the shock of the hook set. But you really want to have your drag really tight. That way you get the best hook set possible. And then as you're bringing that fish closer to the boat, what you can do is you can kind of just loosen it up a little bit to where when that fish gets up close to the boat, it goes to surge, that drag is going to be able to pull and that it's going to absorb that run of that fish. Oftentimes, a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll get really excited when they're reeling a fish in. And I mean, who doesn't really get excited when you've got a really big fish on? When you get that fish up close to the boat, one of the things you want to do is just give that fish a little bit of line and be ready for that fish to surge when he gets close to the boat. I've seen a lot of people, a lot of the trips that I've done, they'll make a big mistake. They'll actually reel the fish all the way up to the rod tip. And the problem with that is that when that fish goes to make its final last run, which they usually do, especially the good ones, there's just no line in order to stretch. And oftentimes what happens, you'll break your line or you'll tear the hook out of the fish's mouth. So setting your drag correctly and using your drag and being mindful of the distance of the fish in relation to the boat and your rod when you're playing it in, all that's going to help you catch more fish and land more fish. Another mistake that often happens, and one thing that a lot of times that I'm really particular about, in dealing with my clientele, is just making sure that they always got the sharpest hook possible that they're using when they're fishing. Over the course of the day, it doesn't matter if you're throwing a crankbait, you might be throwing just a little Ned worm or anything like that. You're putting this bait in places where fish live, and a lot of times those are really rocky. They got a lot of timber, whole bunch of different things that can kind of dull the points on your hooks. And over the course of the day, as you're fishing and you get, the hours start to add up on that lure that you're using, a lot of times your hooks are going to get a little dull. So what I like to do is make sure that I switch those hooks out pretty frequent throughout the day. For the guys that are fishing with me, for throwing crankbaits, I'm going to be changing those hooks a couple times throughout the day because what I want to do is ensure that I have the sharpest hook possible so that when we do get a bite, that fish is going to be coming in the boat. The other thing that a lot of times people kind of overlook when they're fishing is that, even if you're catching fish, you haven't gotten hung up much, everything's going great, you're reeling these big fish in, people kind of overlook checking their line. And you don't even have to necessarily like get caught on anything. But actually, even just in catching fish, a lot of times, when these big bass, they suck your lure in like this, they have those little sandpaper teeth they'll tend to wear just above your bait, especially if they're inhaling the bait. So you might have just landed like a 5-pounder, but you want to make sure that you rub your line because that next cast, you might not be so lucky and you might break them off, even on the hook set or something. So checking your line is a very big deal. When it comes to trying to catch more fish and make sure that you have the strongest line possible when it comes to landing those fish. Now, one other thing to be mindful of that gets overlooked a lot, I see this quite a bit actually, which is kind of surprising, but there's two main kind of danger areas of the boat when you're playing a fish. The worst one is when you're in the back of the boat. You've got the outboard motor hanging down the water. When you're reeling a fish in, you want to kind of like steer them away from that area. I know it seems like common sense, but this happens a lot actually in fishing. Make sure that when you're fighting that fish that you don't really spend a whole lot of time trying to bring them close to the back of the boat because you got a motor back there. Just a lot of bad things can happen, and a lot of times that fish will actually get wrapped up around the prop if you try to play a fish back there. The other area that might seem obvious, but it happens quite a bit, is the front of the boat where the trolling motor is. So you've got like a 45-inch shaft on your trolling motor hanging down in the water, and when you're fighting a fish, one thing you want to try to do is make sure that that fish does not get wrapped up in the trolling motor. Pretty much if a fish gets to that point where he's wrapped around the trolling motor, it just makes it a lot more difficult to land that fish. And oftentimes what's going to either happen is you're going to break your line, or it's going to tear the hook out of the mouth, because when that line's wrapped around the trolling motor, there's nothing to give. So when that fish is surging, those hooks just pull out of his mouth. And one other thing that I've seen happen quite often in fishing is your running lights. So everybody's going to have navigation lights and running lights on their boat, especially if you take out early in the morning. Unless there's some need for you to have those lights out, I always like to make sure that I take those lights out and put them away. I'm sure everybody that's fished for a long enough period of time can agree that that white navigation light that we have on the back of our boat, that we use in low light conditions, that always gets in the way when you're fighting a fish. Just one more thing to go around and watch out for. Now on my boat, I don't have power poles, or I don't have talons or anything like that, but the same thing kind of goes for those too. If you have talons or power poles on the back of your boat, you really want to make sure that you don't get your rod in a position to where that's gonna get in the way of when you're trying to land a fish. These are all things that you got to watch out for. Hopefully though, like some of these things we're talking about, just kind of be mindful and take them into consideration the next time you get out in the water. It's going to help you catch and land a lot more fish, and just be a lot more productive. Until next time guys, good fishing, and we'll have a fishing report later in the week.